Graveyards are melancholy places. If you walk in on a scene from almost any film, you don't have to know anything else about the story to know that at least one character is grieving. Even scenes that are played for laughs still have that desolate atmosphere to them. I'm recording this mid-April at the time of the coronavirus event in 2020. It might be near the end, might be near the beginning. I hope not. A desolation might be a good word for how a lot of us have been feeling lately. People who are outgoing and need to be around others probably have it the worst right now. And even if you're someone who likes social distancing and were an expert at it before the government asked us all to practice that, you still might be quite anxious about the future, especially financially for a lot of us. And here we are this weekend, in which we celebrate the resurrection of Jesus, the most important event in the Bible and history in our lives, celebrating alone. Maybe you saw pictures on social media of kids having birthday parties without any friends over. Not only did none of us expect this, none of us wanted ourselves or our community or our world to be in this situation. And while we'd prefer to be in different circumstances, maybe in a small way, what we're going through right now can give us a ground-level view of what Jesus' first followers experienced that weekend. Maybe we can relate to them better. This is from John chapter 20, starting with verse 1, and I'm reading from the New International Version. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." Well, if this isn't the foul frosting on a gruesome cake, it's difficult to imagine the average person's take on Passover events in Jerusalem that year. The rabbi from Nazareth was a controversial character for most people. Judeans knew the spiritual leadership of the nation felt especially threatened by him. As the gospel writer put it earlier, the New Living Translation, there was a lot of grumbling about him among the crowds. Some argued he's a good man, but others said he is nothing but a fraud who deceives the people. What about the miracles? This guy even raised the dead, the rumors said. If those stories were true, where was he getting his power? Evil spirits were known to perform signs too. It's difficult to overstate the impact that Jesus had in the city when he entered the temple and threw out the merchants and the money changers. This wasn't like cleaning out a larger-than-average church, more like emptying a stadium. For a single person to chase out powerful financial interests meant that this former construction worker from Nazareth had more personality, power, and presence than anybody since King David 1,000 years before. This was too much, so the authorities arranged for the empire to kill him. A slave's death of torture. Jesus' followers were fastidiously Jewish, and so when he was buried that Friday, they watched carefully so they could find a way to embalm him later. They wouldn't do such work on the Sabbath. But then, as we've read, the body was gone. What could have happened? This wasn't like body snatching in more recent days, the early times of modern medicine where resurrectionists, as they were called, tiptoed to fresh graves in the middle of the night to gather fresh corpses for dissection. It would have been a criminal act, to be sure. An ordinary Jew wouldn't go near a grave just before or during the biggest holiday of the year. What good would a criminal find with a common corpse? As for the Romans, shortly after Jesus had been entombed, the National Ruling Council had asked the imperial governor to place a guard to keep anyone from taking that body. While his closest followers had apparently forgotten or disregarded what he'd said about coming back from the dead, apparently his enemies had made a note of it. Thinking the disciples were a whole lot braver than they actually turned out to be, the rulers got soldiers to stand outside the tomb so that no one could come and get him. But by the time Mary Magdalene makes this particular visit to the tomb, the soldiers are gone too. What has happened here? We know the end of the story, and because of that, we want to rush to the moment of revelation. But stay with Mary here. She announces to the male disciples that Jesus' body is gone. She thought she couldn't possibly feel any worse, losing her master and teacher in the worst way possible, publicly humiliating agony. But then the body's gone. Maybe she just was barely keeping from screaming. But here in the text, she's managed to pull it together enough to go find the boys. This is what we find next. So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. This is even weirder. For what purpose a grave robber would take a body and nothing but a body made no sense at all, but this is even stranger. The New International Version here says this cloth was separate from the grave strips, where the English Standard Version, several others, note that the head cloth was folded up. Body snatchers would not take special care like that. The story goes on. Finally, the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, also went inside. He saw and believed. They still did not understand from the scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to where they were staying. This is a bit tricky. If the unnamed disciple, elsewhere we find he's the narrator, John, well, if he believed but didn't understand what they were supposed to have known from their Bibles, what was it exactly that he believed? Perhaps he believed the mystery. Sometime you might come to a place where you can tell God is at work even if you don't understand. Maybe that's what happened here with John. Maybe he wasn't ready to believe that Jesus was back from the dead. Maybe that didn't even occur to him, regardless of what Jesus had told them in advance. But John saw enough to know that God was at work somehow, in what was as yet unexplained. Maybe you're there right now. You're willing to trust that God knows what he's doing, even though nothing is making sense. With what happened next, I have a feeling that they regretted going back inside, back to the room where they had locked themselves in so soon. What happens next is unexpected, and I cannot emphasize this enough. We know the story. We know Mary is going to be interrupted with something that will sweep her sorrows away. We know the story of Acts, and the spread of the gospel around the known world of its day. We have the New Testament as well as the Old, and we have foretellings that the story will continue until the world ends and is made new. We also know that many religions, even up to this time, had stories about this or that deity who died and came back to life. Osiris might be the best known. Of course, those stories wouldn't even occur to Jesus' followers. They were Jews, and the Torah told them not to say even the names of other gods. Mary wouldn't have expected this myth to enter history right in front of her. What happens next is something that could not happen in fiction, at least up till then, because fiction has to make sense. The real world doesn't. Here's what the story says. Now Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white, seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. They asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" Now in the Gospel of Luke, after the resurrection of Jesus, two disciples have an entire conversation with Jesus, the risen Jesus, without recognizing him. Luke tells us they were kept from knowing who he was. But several things going on here make a bizarre situation worse. Where did these figures come from? Why didn't Peter and the other disciples see them when they went inside? Angels were simply heavenly messengers at the time, and they were commonly understood as human-looking figures in white. One such entity at the head and the other at the foot might call to mind a piece of furniture from the ancient temple, lost for centuries before this story. The Ark of the Covenant had on its lids 2 bowing cherubim, heavenly creatures dropping in surrender before the mercy seat, an empty space on the chest where the presence of God used to manifest. This doesn't occur to Mary. She doesn't think of any of this until later. And then the question, what a terrible question. Disrespectful at best, stupid at worst. If you see someone crying in a cemetery, you don't ask them this. Why are you crying? Why am I crying? It's a graveyard. Why do you think I'm crying? They have taken my Lord away, she said, and I don't know where they have put him. At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was Jesus. He asked her, "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you're looking for?" Maybe she was being kept from knowing who he was. Maybe her eyes were so full of tears that she couldn't see. What is Jesus doing here? We're looking at this from the perspective of knowing what had happened. Well, it doesn't change the fact that it's an inappropriate question, and Jesus is the one asking it. Is he a divine troll? You don't mean to be disrespectful. Is he teasing her? I imagine that he has the biggest possible grin on his face. Again, not to be sacrilegious or anything, but I think of the proverbial cat that got the canary. I mean, Jesus did just come out of the grave with, as one writer put it, with the keys of death and hell swinging on his belt. "Woman, why are you crying? Who is it that you are looking for?" Thinking it was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned to him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni." This word sounds a lot like rabbi. I learned just this week that it means literally, "my great one." What Mary probably called Jesus before this happened. She recognized his voice, the tone that he used when he addressed her like he used to. She must have rushed to him because he says, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." This is one more bit of the story that tells us that Jesus was not a ghost. She could not have grabbed on to something immaterial. And so this woman, out of whom Jesus at one time had cast 7 demons, becomes the first preacher, the first evangelist, the first to let anyone at all know that Jesus was not dead anymore. Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord," and she told them that he had said these things to her. I saw a sermon online this week in which the preacher pointed out just how much like our situation the disciples were in back then. They were isolated behind locked doors. They were worried about being confronted by the authorities if they were found outside. The disciples had left their jobs many months before and now had to think about how they were going to feed themselves. Peter, at least, was married and had a family to think of. And they had lost someone they loved most, their teacher, their master. Then the last thing they expected happened. They found themselves in a world upside down from everything they thought they knew. We know how things turned out for them. Not that the resurrection of Jesus Christ took away all future suffering from them, far from it. But they knew that because he was alive, they didn't have to be afraid of suffering or death or anything anymore. We don't know what's going to happen next either. But if Jesus came back from the dead, the universe doesn't work the way that we might have thought it did. We don't have to be afraid either of death, of sickness, of suffering, because our brother, did you notice that's what he called himself here? Our brother stands before the Almighty, keeping for us the healing and salvation that he won for us at the cross. He promised to come back again, and until then, as he said at the end of another gospel, he is with us always, even to the end of the world.